The time has come for me to upgrade the suspension on my Marin Rift Zone 2 with this Fox 34 rhythm fork and this Fox Float DPS rear shock. So if you caught my recent long-term review on this Marin Rift Zone 2, you'll know that there's a couple things that I don't like about the suspension. In terms of the rear shock, it's a Rockshox Deluxe Select with debonair sleeve. Now that's actually a really good rear shock, especially considering the price range, but it doesn't have a lockout. So that's one thing I don't like about it. The other thing, completely my own doing, I wrecked and I scratched the stanchion or shock body. I'm not really sure what it's called. But anyway, there's a gouge in it. I tried to fill it with some nail varnish. It's not too bad, but it did leak oil for a long time, and it's actually, I think it's run out of oil on the inside. Nothing else is really leaking out. So I was faced with the decision of either paying to have the whole thing rebuilt and also putting in a new stanchion or shock body, whatever you call it. And the cost of that was actually almost identical to what I got this Fox Float DPS shock off a Pink Bike for. This was a brand new takeoff off of a Santa Cruz 5010. It does have a lockout, and the really cool thing about it, besides it actually fitting properly, is that it has the exact same custom tune specs as the Marin Rift Zone 3, which comes with a Fox Float DPS. When it comes to the fork, the Rockshox Recon, it's a budget air fork. It just doesn't have the greatest feel to it. I mentioned it before, but if you lower the air pressure, it dives too much. If you put the right amount of air pressure in it, you never use all the travel, and that's still the case now. I've even lowered it a little bit more than what I had it at, and I'm still leaving like almost a full inch of travel that's not even being used. So this was a little bit of an impulse buy. There was a guy locally who was selling a Santa Cruz Tallboy, and this was the stock fork on that, and he'd replaced his with a Pike. So I picked this up from him for a pretty good price. So this should be a pretty simple swap over of these two parts, unless I run into some weird surprises along the way. So without any further ado, let's get to it. So this isn't really meant to be a tutorial on how to swap over your suspension. There's plenty of videos on YouTube showing you that. So I'm just going to give you a couple thoughts along the way. So in terms of swapping this rear shock, it's about as simple as it gets. There's two bolts holding it on. And to make things even easier, I had all the new hardware pressed in by my favorite shop here in Richmond, which is Outpost. I highly recommend them to anybody in the area. So I've just come across my first surprise, but it's actually a pleasant one. Taking this off and holding it in my hand, I can tell that it's actually heavier than the Fox DPS that's going on. So let's just get a couple quick weights and see what the difference is. All right, so the Rockshox Deluxe that's coming off, 338.5 grams. The Fox DPS that's going on, 279.5. When it comes to the actual performance of this Fox DPS shock, I'm not really expecting it to be that much better than the Rockshox that came off of there, except for the fact that it has the compression adjustment. And the lockout especially is one of the things I'm really looking forward to, and I'll explain why later in this video. For setting up this shock, I'm really just going to follow the Fox recommendations, and I'm also going to take a look at the Marin recommendations, since this is the same shock that came stock on the Rift Zone 3. But I'm going to do what they're telling me in terms of my weight and what that means for the air pressure, and what that means for the rebound dampening. Moving on to the fork. This is a little bit more involved, but should also be pretty simple as long as there's no weird surprises on the way. So in a previous video, I actually increased the travel on this Rockshox Recon to 140 millimeters, and I really didn't feel like I noticed too much of a difference at all from doing that. This Fox 34 that's going on is actually 130 millimeters, so it's going to be interesting to see if I can notice a difference going back to the stock travel. Alright, pleasant surprise number 2, the Fox 34 is considerably lighter. For the Recon, we've got 2,391 grams, and for the Fox 34, we are at 2,068.5 grams. So that is a total weight savings of 381.5 grams, or 0.84 pounds, which is awesome because I wasn't expecting that at all. So here's my method of cutting a steerer tube. I don't have a pipe cutter. I also don't have a hacksaw guide specifically made for cutting steerer tubes. So what I like to do is mark the entire way around the steerer tube, Then I take the hacksaw and I score into it, and I rotate the fork and I score into it again until I've scored the entire way around, which creates its own guide. Then what I like to do is constantly be rotating the fork as I'm cutting, so I'm never cutting deep in, because that's when the hacksaw can start to stray to one side or the other. So by doing that method, and if you have a sharp blade, which I didn't, this took forever, but usually that method works out really well. The cut's nice and straight if you take your time, and all you have to do is a little bit of filing at the end. So you might be wondering what's up with all the different versions of the 34. The Rhythm is actually the lowest of them all. The Rhythm is only original equipment on certain bikes, so you can't just go buy a Rhythm fork. And really the main thing that sets it apart from the performance is just the heavier aluminum that's used, although we've just found out that it's still pretty lightweight. So you may or may not also know that Fox owns Marzocchi. The Marzocchi Bomber Z2 is what comes on the Marin Rift Zone 3. And basically, that's a Fox 34 with the heavier type of aluminum and with a different damper. So this has the grip damper, which is a little bit more desirable. It's almost like one step above the Marzocchi Bomber Z2, one little step below the Fox Performance 34. The other nice thing about this is that unlike the Recon, you can actually tune this with volume spacers. Well, that all went together exactly according to plan. There were no bad surprises, only one good surprise, and that was the weight savings on both the shock and the fork. I'm going to do something that I haven't done in a while, and that's actually weigh this bike. I was a little obsessed, a little bit critical about the weight of this bike when I first got it. I think it was something like 36 pounds or something like that. Now I have a lighter drivetrain on there. I've got obviously lighter suspension, different tires. My tire setup has actually just changed. I just put on this dissector on the rear, which is a little bit heavier than the Recon that came off, but that Recon was pretty much toast, and I just wanted to try something new. So keep an eye out for a review on that coming up eventually too. But let's check out the weight on this real quick. And yes, I know this is not the most scientific method out there. 216 on the nose. And now my weight, 183.2. So that makes that actually just a little bit under 33 pounds, 32.8. Again, not the most scientific method out there, but that is some significant weight savings over stock form. Keep in mind that those weights are with my pedals, with my bottle cage, and with the little clip that holds on my pump, but the pump is not on there. So the only thing left to do is to get this thing out on the trails to see how this new suspension performs, if I can feel a difference, if it was worth the time, worth the money that I put into it. All right, so I've gotten a handful of rides in now. So I feel like I can talk about the similarities and the differences. The biggest noticeable difference is on rock gardens or anything where there's repeated impacts in a row. This is a perfect example. A lot of rocks in a row, and the bike just feels a little bit more composed over it. Whereas before, repeated hits, it just kind of like confused the suspension, or I don't know, it just didn't quite feel right. That's probably mostly down to the fork, I would think. That's another good example there of where it just feels more composed with those repeated hits. But where I don't really notice it though is like single hits, like that, single roots. Not really much of a difference. In terms of the setup, I have not really strayed from the recommendations on the rebound. The air pressure, which is how it was before, was too much for me, the recommendation. I mean, it kind of got the sag right, but then I didn't use all the travel. Now, one thing that doesn't really relate to the trails so much, but I love the lockout. on the shock. And that's mostly because I've been riding, I do these lunch break rides. I've lately been riding from my work to get to the trails, which is about 2 or so miles of road and some gravel. And being able to lock that thing out is awesome. It just makes it feel like a hardtail almost. It still takes a little bit of the edge off, but way more efficient pedaling, which means I get to get here quicker. Now that's the 3-position adjustable on that shock, and obviously the lockout makes a big difference. But going from fully open to, medium, I don't know what it's even called, I don't really notice any difference in that at all. So to answer my own question, was it worth it? That I don't know. I mean, it is better, but it's not like hugely better. If the rear shock was in great condition and I hadn't scratched it up, then I don't know if I would be replacing it. The fork, probably would have prioritized that if the shock was in great shape, because I think that's contributing to more of the stability I feel on rocks and roots, and also where the biggest chunk of the weight savings came too. Oh yeah, and the travel difference. So I guess I had gotten used to the 140 more than I thought, because I do feel a little more hunched over on this. So I started looking at riser bars. I think what I'll do is probably just increase the travel on this one too, though, back to 140. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. Give me a thumbs up if you did. If you're looking to upgrade your suspension, keep an eye on the used market. Pink Bike, Facebook Marketplace, all that stuff. Because there's some really good deals to be had out there. It's astonishing how people buy, pretty expensive bikes and then take off those parts and put on really expensive parts. But that is to the benefit of you and me and anybody else out there willing to look. Well, anyway, thanks again for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you next time.